This is Hannibal back here from the HannibalTV.com, and I just finished listening to Kevin Sullivan's deep dive into Bret Hart and WCW, which I put the link in the description. And he definitely discusses that WCW blew it with Bret. They didn't capitalize on his momentum at all when he jumped from WWE to WCW. I was there for the Survivor Series, and I was there the next night in Ottawa where he no-showed. And before he went to WCW, they had the Team Canada versus the D-Generation X or whatever type feud with Shawn Michaels, and at various times feuding with Austin. But there was a Canada-US feud going on. I think Owen Hart wrestled Austin, for instance, at the Survivor Series, from what I recall. And they were doing a thing where Raw was often in Canada, and then WCW, and then then it'd be in the US the next week. So you'd constantly see the reactions from both places, where the heels and faces were reversed, and that was most obvious at the Canadian Stampede, which I recently heard Vince Russo say on one of his podcasts on this channel. That was one of the loudest crowds and best atmosphere he ever had. But anyways, I actually looked it up because I remember thinking, well, WCW is going to start coming to Canada now after that incident happened in 97, because to capitalize on the momentum, right? Well, in fact, they only came about 8 times from 1999 to 2000. They didn't even come the next year, unless I'm missing something, which is possible. If they did come the next year, it may have only been once. But they hadn't been to Canada since like the early 90s, when they only did a handful of shows again in the Toronto area and on the East Coast, I guess. And then Jacques Rougeau promoted that WCW show in 96 in Montreal, where he beat Hulk Hogan. And I was there for that too. And I must say, that was a better show overall than the Survivor Series 97. There was a lot of WCW fans in Canada. But from what I can see, I mean, it was over a year before they came to Canada. They came to Toronto not until March 1999. And then they did a WCW Saturday night taping after they shot the Nitro in Toronto the next night in the small town of Kitchener, rather than go to Montreal or another big city like Ottawa. They do one of the smaller cities right around Toronto for Saturday night. I think actually as crappy as a program Saturday night was by that point, they probably could have sold out Montreal, because even if they just put Bret as an appearance on a Saturday night, which wouldn't have made sense, but people were like so desperate for WCW content, they could have got like a massive crowd in a major city for a Saturday night. Because there's also guys like Chris Jericho in WCW for a while. And they did come to Winnipeg once, just one time, and they didn't use Bret Hart on that. But it was a house show, but they went to Winnipeg without Bret Hart. Then they did the 2 Mayhem pay-per-views in Toronto. And then randomly, they went to British Columbia for a pay-per-view and a Nitro in 2000. I don't think they ever filmed a Thunder here. It was just, they never came to Calgary or Edmonton. Like, they just blew it because Bret had so much momentum, and they really could put him on the map. And the fans were like dying to see you would see NWO shirts all over the place around that time. And they just never came. So that was one of the big mistakes. And I agree with what Kevin was saying in the podcast. There's pretty much only a couple things he's remembered for: the plate thing with Goldberg, the Chris Benoit match to a lesser extent. Basically being like they did practically nothing memorable with him. When he won the title, he lost pretty much all of his momentum. But Kevin Sullivan did mention in the podcast the night after his concussion with Goldberg, he did actually wrestle Goldberg. And then he wrestled about 10 more times after that in WCW. And then he went on to wrestle Vince McMahon in WWE. So I don't know if I don't know. I'm no doctor, but one thing's for sure, he certainly made out well financially going back to WWE after all that. And yeah, I'm just still disappointed to this day that WCW blew it. I was never a huge Bret Hart fan, but he did have a crazy amount of momentum then, and I was already a WCW fan. And at the time when the screw job first happened, Canadians were really, really pissed at WWE and Vince for doing that, just because they supported Bret, because he wasn't like whining publicly for decades by this point, where a lot of Canadians have like written him off now, but they supported him. But then WCW never came here, so it was like WCW didn't care about Canada, even though they had a lot of fans here. So ultimately WWE kept coming, and they ended up winning the war. But that was definitely one of their biggest mistakes, letting all that momentum go. As soon as they signed him, they should have like booked a real Canadian tour, and it would have done well. 1998 WCW was as hot as ever, and they could have had really good crowds in major cities. But that's just my thoughts on it. They had less than 10 shows in Canada after signing Bret Hart between the time they signed him to their demise. So that was really bad booking, whoever was in charge of their arena booking.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV